Friends, would you pray with me? Holy and loving God, take our lips and speak through them. Take our minds and think with them. Take our hands and work with them. And take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you. Amen. Like the annual report, there is nothing quite like a good ending. Now for books, Tolkien's Return of the King is of course high on my list. Frodo and Sam, something about a ring, something about a Dark Lord Sauron, Tree of Life returning. But for movies, one of my favorite good ending movies is Shawshank Redemption, 1994. It's more than 20 years old at this point. Tim Robbins plays one Andy Dufresne, a banker who's sentenced to life at Shawshank State Penitentiary for the murder of his wife and her lover, despite his claims of innocence. During his time in prison, he befriends a fellow inmate, Morgan Freeman, who plays the character Red. And inside prison, they find a mutual inspiration from one another. I'll give a little bit more away. So, spoiler alert, the end of the movie is really what I want to lift up. There's this wonderful scene where both Andy and Red have been let out of prison in different ways, and they're quite separated from one another. And Red is quite depressed, and he's fearful of taking his own life, until he remembers a story that Andy told him, some mystical story about a rock and a wall in some faraway field. And somehow he manages to find himself in that field and finds the rock and uncovers a letter left by Andy, which says, "Red, if you're reading this, you've gotten out. And if you've come this far, maybe you're willing to go a little further. Remember, Red, hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies. I will be hoping that this letter finds you and keeps you well, your friend Andy Dufresne." We then see Red go to a far-off place, implying that he connects later with his dear friend. Good endings are good, and I love them. I'm sure I'm not alone, especially those that speak about redemption, speak about hope. And so when we open our gospel reading this morning to the beginning of Luke, we have a good story of a good beginning, not an ending. But it is a good story of a good beginning. It is a beginning here of Jesus' inaugural speech, Jesus' first declaration at the beginning. And it has something to do with a good ending. Now, these wonderfully written and well-known verses come to us as Jesus returns from the wilderness to his own home. He returns to Nazareth. And in that place where he was brought up, in that place of familiar smells and customs, remember Jesus was very, very Jewish, as Fred Craddock loves to remind us, Jesus returns to what is familiar. John Dominic Crossan and Jonathan Reed explain that Nazareth was a small Jewish settlement of no more than 200 or to 400 villagers, representing a dozen or so extended families off the beaten path in a faraway, mystical place in some ways. Jesus grew up in that place, in the fields, rock walls, olive gardens, grain fields, figs and pomegranates being the things that reminded him of home and reminded him of familiarity. And in that place, Jesus comes and unrolls that scroll, saying, "The Spirit of God is upon me, God has anointed me, to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, letting the oppressed go free, and proclaiming the year of God's favor." Presbyterian D. Mark Davis likes to refer to this opening speech of Jesus in this one line: "A Spirit of the Lord is on me to release those who have been shattered in freedom." Mark Davis sees that Jesus is releasing those shattered by freedom in any way. And in so doing, it is important to notice that Jesus not only is coming up with these words on his own, but is reframing the words of Isaiah that we know well. 3rd Isaiah, towards the end of the book of Isaiah. These words are indeed not about belief or dogma, but about liberation with real-life applications for those who have been shattered in any way, in broken relationships, in a world of violence, in facing death in very difficult ways. These are words that lift up and provide a word of redemption and a word of hope. Of course, it is a word of jubilee as well, jubilee justice. We are loving the amplification of that by the Catholic Church right now, thanks to Pope Francis. This year is a year of jubilee, a year of mercy. It is a year where the grain is let fallow and the fields are given a rest, a Sabbath year. And yet this is also a declaration that things are to change. And so this good beginning links us directly to a good ending. For it is these very words that Jesus calls and reclaims for his own, saying, I am the one who is about these words in your midst. It is these words that call him to the cross. They have a real implication for him, for we know the cross was a place where seditionists were killed by the Roman Empire, and that is the way Jesus ends his life. It is through these words that directly link him to that ending. And in that way, we remember that the end is not there on the cross, but we as people of faith celebrate an empty tomb and a resurrection Easter. And so ultimately these words of a good beginning link us to a good ending that says that death does not have the last word. In a familiar place, Jesus is reminded of who he is and therefore tells the world what to expect of God. When I was in a familiar place among the equivalent figs and pomegranates, the eastern white pines of Dover, Massachusetts, my hometown, when I was there, that was the place where I first experienced death. In a good way. My dear bunny named Midnight, 5 years old I was, and I don't know how old Midnight was, died of natural causes. And Midnight was beloved to me. And I experienced not only his death, but then a chance to, with my father, bury Midnight in the soil right behind where I played. And I could sense the spirit of Midnight in a way being with me as I played from that point forward. When I was 18, I had a very similar experience, experiencing the death of my beloved Sam, Samantha, our dog, our Irish setter golden retriever, the spaz that she was. She ran incessantly through those woods, and as she grew quite old and decrepit, blind and unable to walk, instead of taking her to the vet, my brother and father were able to give her a mercy kill in our backyard, and then we had a chance to bury her together. A very dramatic thing for an 18-year-old who loved his beloved dog, but a really good ending for Sam, an honoring thing in a place that we were able to smell the familiarity of that soil and see that death did not have the final word. I can still sense the spirit of Sam in my own life. That good ending has helped my good living. I feel I am called to that way of energy, that call of excitement, of adventuring into the woods, all the things that my dog helped me see through those unconditional loving eyes of a beloved pet. Friends, death is sacred, death is universal. We of course all experience it. We all have experienced it in our lives in very different ways. No one has the monopoly on what death is in their own experience. Some of us have experienced good death in those kind of ways. Some of us have experienced really horrible death in our lives and in the world. And yet it is a natural part of life. It is a very important part of our faith life. It is profoundly mystical, profoundly unknown. We call it the great unknown, the great beyond for very real reasons. And our Reformed theological roots begin at that point, that we have no idea. We can't explain away what death is or what is beyond. C.S. Lewis, in a wonderful book on death and grief, A Grief Observed, wrote that we cannot understand. The best is perhaps that we understand least. And so there is that call to a humility as we approach the discussions around end-of-life care, of thinking about what death means for us and for our world, and to acknowledge that none of us are in the same place. That is an important part for our beginning. And yet, we remember too that there is nothing morbid about the idea of death. There is nothing morbid about talking about death. It is something that is sometimes painful for us to discuss, but it is something that we are called to do. And therefore we are enjoying the gift of what is the Conversation Project here at this church. We were introduced to that in the fall, and now for this Sunday and next we will engage that as a congregation together to talk together about having that very conversation with our loved ones, about the stewardship around our own dying and our own wishes around death and those that we love. Of course, we will only begin to scratch the surface in 2 Sundays around this very deep and real context and topic. So I encourage us to continue these conversations as we move ahead in our worship and in our life together. One of my first encounters of death before the 2 pets of mine in a precognitive way was the death of my grandpa Mark, the one whom I shared my earliest memories with at the age of 2. And I don't remember any of this, of course, but my mother likes to retell this story that a few days after he died suddenly of a heart attack mowing the lawn, in church that day, some church members came up to apparently comfort me, and out of my mouth came the words, "Grandpa is home with Jesus." And this idea was somehow put in my brain in a beautiful way, received not from my own mind, but from the hearts and witness of the congregation in which I was formed. And that is a beautiful, centered, orthodox Christian belief that we and our lives are held in the very palm of God's hands, and life does not end with death. And so that beautiful idea, we have many terms for it: eternal life, unity with God, home, peace, no tears any longer, full of unknowing. These terms are inadequate and yet are important for us to name, to share with each other the stories around these things. And I, as someone who has had experiences of these in a good way, are sure that those are not the end. I am sure I will see Samantha again, my dog. I am sure that I will see Mandela again. I am sure of all of these things in some unknowing type of way. The Bible tells us a whole lot about death, and yet at the same time, obviously comes up short. We, as ourselves, have to be engaged in this context. And one of the few things I like to lift up, one of the important things I like to lift up about the biblical narrative around death is the idea of grass, dust, and lilies. We know we are like grass. Many of the scriptures tell us about this. Psalm 103, as mortals, our days are like grass. They flourish like a flower of the field, for the wind passes over it, and it is gone, and its place knows it no more. And so all flesh is like grass, as 1 Peter describes it. There is this idea that life is short. It is seemingly humble, and there's humility in being named a grass of the field. And yet there is this beauty that emerges from Genesis: for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. That beloved compost of which we are, this beauty that the considering of the lilies that is lifted up in Luke does not say that the grass has the final word. And yet even Solomon in all of his glory was not clothed like one of you. If God so clothes the grasses of the field, which are alive today and tomorrow thrown into the oven, how much more will God clothe you? So we are like grass, and yet we are beloved in that eternal worth. The steadfast love of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting. Today in our time together, we'll have a handout that goes over just some of a brief overview of some of the core scriptural references to death and this idea of being held in the palm of God's hand in the midst of it. And I encourage us to share not only those with one another, but to think about other informative scriptures or poems or references that refer to this idea. In our New Testament lesson this day that Kay so beautifully read, we hear of some familiar images lifted up by the Apostle Paul in his correspondence with that young Christian community in Corinth. Now, this is just one of the 2, perhaps 3 letters written to that community that we have. And it is perhaps a overly well-known analogy lifted up today. We are a body. We as individual followers of Christ are separate, have our separate body parts, only made complete and whole in relationship to other parts of the Christian community. Therefore, a hand cannot say to a foot, I am no longer in relationship, because then the whole body, of course, would suffer. And when one member of the body suffers, we all suffer. Now, these words of Paul were originally directed at a fledgling community of believers, perhaps frightened at their own potential death of their own church. Paul implored them to recognize their critical need for one another in facing the forces that were greater than themselves. So too we as a community here in this place, beginning to ponder the mystery that is death in the light of the promise that is our faith, we might take these words in a new way to our hearts. We are never alone in both reflecting on our death and dying. We are never alone in the process of death and dying. This is a profoundly orthodox, profoundly reformed theological idea. We again I want to turn to some of the quotes and some of the scripture before us, and I like to reference one of my favorite poets, Wendell Berry, in this process. For sometimes poetry is better than prose, better than our understanding, something that is so deep. So I offer this poem, Testament, written by Wendell Berry, as we think about this together. Dear relatives and friends, when my last breath grows large and free in air, don't call it death. A word to enrich the undertaker and inspire his surely art of imitating life. Conspire against him. Say that my body cannot now be improved upon. It has no fault to show to the sly cosmetician. Say that my flesh has a perfect compliance with the grass, truer than any it could have striven for. You will recognize the earth in me as before I wished to know it myself. My earth, that has been my care and faithful charge from birth, and toward which all my sorrows were surely bound, all of my hopes. Say that I have found a good solution and am on my way to the roots, and say that I have left my native clay at last to be a traveler. That too will also be so. Traveler to where? Say you don't know. But do not let your ignorance of my spirit's whereabouts dismay you or overwhelm your thoughts. Be careful not to say anything too final. Whatever is unsure is possible, and life is bigger than flesh. Beyond reach of thought, let imagination figure your hope. That will be generous to me and to yourselves. Why settle for some known it's all despair, when the dead may dance to the fiddle, hereafter, for all anybody knows. Poetry better than prose. As I prepared to think about these things together in our adult ed today, I asked a dear Jewish friend of mine who happens to be a doctor who works with people suffering from traumatic brain injuries what she thought about death. And she quickly, without much hesitation, took this very serious question and said, it's all about how we live. Which reminded me, of course, of John 10:10, I have come to bring you life abundantly, as Jesus puts it, which reminds us of how we live and how we die. The idea of a good ending and a good beginning links us again to the inaugural statement of Jesus. How he lived his life related to how he began and how he saw himself rooted in the image of God, called into the ways of prophetic justice, called into the ways of love, even as his body aged and changed. For him, by the forces of the state. For many of us, by the forces of gravity, the forces of natural aging process. How we live makes an incredible difference in our story, in our life story. We, of course, cannot predict how we will end and how we will die, but we can do what we can to be good stewards of that process, regardless of how old we are, or how young we are, or how young we feel, or how old we feel. We have a chance to be good stewards of ourselves and our families and our communities. So this is an invitation to think about that. Many of us have engaged in the 5 wishes process we have on file here at the church. Some of you who have written out your last wishes and desires to share with us. That is a beautiful and loving way to tell a good ending story. It is a way of stewardship, and I commend us in this process to be in it together, to be honest with our feelings with one another, and to wonder together about beauty, wonder about the story that we're able to tell together as people who are beloved, grass, as people who know that we are not alone. And I leave us with a quote from Barbara Brown Taylor in her book, Leaving Church, a Memoir of Faith. In contemplating death and dying, she says these words, "Life springs from death, not only at the last, but also in the many little deaths along the way. When everything you count on for protection has failed, the divine presence does not fail. The hands are still there, not promising to rescue, not promising to intervene, promising only to hold you no matter how far you fall. Ironically, those who try hardest not to fall learn this later than those who topple more easily. The ones who find their lives are the losers, while the winners come in last." Friends, let us as a community remind ourselves the protection of the divine presence is always with us and in us and among us. As we sing together the beautiful words, "Day is done." Let us engage these words. Day is done and love unfailing dwells ever here. Shadows fall, but hope prevailing calms every fear. Eyes will close, but you, unsleeping, watch by our side. Death may come to love's safekeeping, still we abide. God of love, all evil quelling, sin forgiving, fear dispelling, stay with us, our hearts indwelling, this eventide. Amen.